Hi, folks. I guess I'm on. I'm coming to you from California, so it's morning here. I'm going to start sharing my screen and get started with the talk on the introduction to self-sovereign identity. Share a screen. No. Window. There we go. There we go. So, I wanted to tell you a little bit about how I got started in working on this. So a long time ago and far, far away in 1999, a group got together, Planetwork got together 50 different environmental groups and asked a poignant question, which was this at the time, sort of the widespread use of the web was about 5 years old, and they asked this question is how could we use this for our common cause, addressing these environmental issues? And unfortunately, there was two answers, and neither of them was very good. One was that everyone would be together in one big portal that they could build, and the other was they could stay isolated, and nobody wanted to give up their autonomy to merge all together into one big portal. And after this, they went on an inquiry about how they could get connected but not lose their autonomy, and to build a movement that was bigger. So in 2000, they hosted this conference, Global Ecology and Information Technology, and they pursued sort of inquiry into these ideas between 2000 and 2002 in the Link Tank, and they managed to come to some pretty good conclusions. They thought about that organizations should have their own distinct digital identities, and that people would need to have their own distinct digital identities, and that they could connect to each other on their own terms. And it would be the mesh of people who were participating in more than one group that would help weave this together, not the actual technical architecture that would be imposed and sort of force everybody into one thing. Sorry. So they put their ideas down into this paper, The Augmented Social Network, Building Identity and Trust into the Next Generation Internet. And I still recommend reading it for people, and you can also read the shorter versions that have been authored since. But I'll read this statement. Underlying this report, it's the assumption that every individual ought to have the right to control his or her own online identity. You should be able to decide what information about yourself is collected as part of your digital profile, and of that information who has access to different aspects of it. Certainly, you should be able to read the complete contents of your own digital profile at any time. An online identity should be maintained as a capacity that gives the user many forms of control. And without flexible access and control, trust in the system of federated identity will be minimal. A digital profile is not treated by the corporations who host them as a formal extension of the person it represents, but if this crucial data about you is not owned by you, what right do you have to manage its use? A civil society approach to persistent identity is a cornerstone of the Augmented Social Network project. So this vision was articulated back then. It was actually shopped around to several foundations who didn't understand what they were talking about, didn't want to invest in open standards, but it nonetheless painted a vision that I was inspired by and many others to pursue, making that vision real for people to own and control their digital representations of themselves. And you can see that the vision that they articulated of people and organizations being connected is the in-between space between staying isolated and one big portal. And so since that time, I've been pursuing innovating protocols to represent people in the digital realm that empower them. And one of the avenues that I've done this is through something called the Internet Identity Workshop. We are once again going to be hosting this workshop virtually. It had been in person for the first 14 years of its existence. And we'll probably figure out a hybrid by the spring, but we really had to go digital like so many other things. And we have been the home of lots of open standards and protocol, born and nested at IIW. This is a sampling of them. The ones in pink on the right are ones that are more recent and are related to self-sovereign identity. But before I dive into those details and share those basics, I wanted to step back and just share my thoughts about why protocols matter and why infrastructure matters. Here is a map of roads that the Romans built in Great Britain. This was over 2,000 years ago, and these roads still are visible. You can find them in the British landscape, and they are infrastructure. And infrastructure, if done well, has extraordinarily long life and is useful to many people for many purposes. And in fact, the current roads and railway lines and highways follow these roads oftentimes. And we get to railroads. Railroads are also a really interesting development in human transportation and history. We built them across North America, and we also did something else to help these systems run. We invented time that was standard in time zones. Before the railroads and before the invention of standard time, each city, each town on the railroad stop literally had its own time based on when the sun was overhead at noon. This made sense if you were, just riding between places on horseback, but railroads meant that there were these large locomotives driving through. You needed to know when they were leaving your town. And they had come up with very complex systems for the railroad to help people tell in local time when the train was actually arriving and leaving for their place. But this became untenable at scale. And so someone said, well, why don't we all orient to one of the biggest cities in our region? And then it became clear that dividing the country up into these zones made sense. Another thing that emerged along these railroad tracks is communications infrastructure. This is a telegraph sender. You tap on it, long and short taps. And these cables for telegraphs were run along railway lines. This is a picture of telegraph networks throughout Europe, and this is a network of telegraph networks under the sea. This is all in the 1800s, and the standards bodies to help manage this are that old. They're 150 years old. So if you go and interact with the older standards bodies, I always have great empathy. I'm like, you are the grandfathers of us trying to make standards for these protocols. For this technical world that we live in. And they standardized how these systems worked and operated globally. In the United States, institution was created called the Bureau of Standards. It's now known as NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technologies. And standards play a really important role in commerce and business and just life. Because imagine if every time you went to buy vegetables in the market, you had to have a discussion about how much it weighed and negotiate about the weighing. Or if you wanted to buy a liquid commodity, if you had to negotiate about the amount of liquid. With standards, these things are just set and everybody can agree on them and then worry about other things. So they provide a recipe for reality. And so here's another example of a standard that has shaped the modern world, the container. So protocols, these are quotes from the book called Protocol. Protocol is a system of distributed management that facilitates peer-to-peer relationships between autonomous entities. And if we want digital identity to have the qualities that I spoke of before, we have to innovate the protocols to do this. So one example is SMTP that we've invented to send email. So anybody with an email address can send email to anyone else with an email address. Internet protocols allow for the interoperation between computers. Another example is HTML and CSS that bring us web pages. Protocol is a language that regulates flow, directs next state, codes relationship, and connects life forms. It is etiquette for autonomous agents. So these are all from this book that I was inspired by pretty early on in my career. So I'll ask this question, which is, where is layer 8? Where are the protocols for people and for user interactions? For those of you not familiar, this is the OSI stack of all the different protocol layers that make up the internet. And we are on a quest to create this layer 8. So now I'll shift into talking about digital identity and some of the core concepts and then get into the standards. So this is an architecture that is very common on the web, although thankfully it's becoming less common, where you show up at a website and you're asked to create a new account every time at every new site. And so you have a new username and password, and you would literally have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of accounts. This is untenable in the long run. It doesn't make any sense. And this question of how can I take my digital avatar and go to multiple places is a really good one. So then we have this other model, a private sector identity provider model, where you have a relationship with what we call in the identity business an identity provider, and then you go through that to get to multiple organizations. OpenID Connect was innovated at our conference, did not have this architectural vision in mind at the beginning, but nonetheless, that's what has emerged. And you have today on the internet many opportunities to log in with these companies. And I'm guessing where some of you are based in Southeast Asia, that there are other options that include some Chinese companies where you could log in with them. And so this question is, should these large companies be in relationship with us like this by controlling our identities? in between us and other organizations we connect with. Another option for autonomy and digital identity is we could rent a URL. In fact, the original OpenID sort of envisioned everybody on the planet having a URL of some type, and people just don't understand that their personal identity should be connected to this thing, and it wasn't designed for that. But even say we did, we rent it, we pay a domain name fee. We could use our phone numbers, but we do not own our phone numbers. The phone company, we rent them from the phone company. If we don't pay our bill, they'll give our phone number to someone else. And it's part of a global hierarchical namespace, both of these that are internationally managed, which is fine. They are useful tools, but they are not good sources or anchors for personal digital identity for these control architecture reasons. And some people have tried within our industry to create a special namespace for people. This has been tried quite a few times. I am firmly of the belief that it is a failed enterprise and will not succeed. So that comes to our shining star, the new Decentralized Identifier. This is an open standard that is almost on the tip of to be formally standard by the W3C. It has a schema type, a method, and a method-specific identifier. In the true spirit of being decentralized, you can invent your own decentralized identifier method, and you can list it in the registry that they keep of different methods. There is also a universal resolver, so you can write the code needed to resolve to your decentralized identifier in whichever medium it's hosted. So a decentralized identifier has a public key and a private key that you keep private in a wallet or some other tool. It's a key value store, so each decentralized identifier has with it a JSON LD document describing the entity identified by the DID. Has a DID for self-description, a set of keys for verification, a set of authentication protocols for authentication. So that means that I could challenge you to see if you actually are in control of a particular DID with an authentication protocol. Set of endpoints for interaction, which is like a URL or another locator to go and interact with that particular decentralized identifier and its owner. And then, sorry, I don't know what happened. And at the bottom, we have a timestamp for audit history and a signature for integrity. These DIDs and DID documents can go on any number of shared ledger. There are DID methods for all of these different tools. There are many active DID method specs, as I mentioned. I believe there's close to 100 now. A DID method specification defines how to read, write, and write a DID and its DID document on a specific blockchain or distributed network. And each DID method specifies the syntax for the method-specific identifier. That's that really long number. Any method of specific elements of a DID document and how to create, read, update, and delete the DID and DID document on a target system. Here is an example of how the universal resolver works. There is any app that is handed a DID can send it to the universal resolver, or they could run their own. It's open source code, and they can receive back a DID and DID document. Some DIDs, importantly, stay private and are between parties only. Two examples of these types of DID methods are DID key and DID peer, and they support pairwise agent-to-agent encrypted private messaging. So this is a really important feature that we need to build a web a new layer of the internet for people and for their communications between each other that is not mediated by applications and by application namespaces or by external namespaces. So we have tools like WhatsApp and Signal, but those are mediated by our phone numbers as the identifiers in those systems, which, as we saw before, are controlled by the phone companies, right? So this would allow us to have similar type of functionality where two peer agents use DIDCOM to talk to each other. So I've just talked a lot about these really, really long numbers. They are really awesome for doing deep infrastructure stuff for computers. But the question is raised, so what about the people? And this is where we get to the functionality that really has the most usefulness to humans, which is verifiable credentials. So there's this question of how does a holder of a credential share it with a verifier and have it be believed? And today we have a whole paper-based universe, fancy gimmicks and all sorts of security features. These have served us well. Paper is an amazing technology, and it is reaching its limits of functionality. And as more and more things have gone digital, which has accelerated in the pandemic, there's a real question of how do I actually do this in the digital world? Well, one way that some folks innovated was to create systems like Aadhaar that phone home to a centralized database. So every time you use your Aadhaar number, you're asked to authenticate. It goes and checks with the central database, and the central database knows that you're using your number. It leads to complex complexity in these systems, and it also generates a lot of data exhaust. And the folks that I work with regularly here in Canada, the US, and Europe are very keen that they support citizens having true information that is about themselves, and they, as Western liberal democracies, don't want to go anywhere near seeing all of the places that individuals use their identity information. It's none of their business, and they don't want it to be. So I'm going to walk through this model of how verifiable credential exchanges work. You have the issuer, the wallet holder, the individual, and a verifier, and you have a shared ledger or other immutable data store. The individual has their own little private ledger where they collect and sort of manage their pairwise decentralized identifiers that they have. Actually, I kind of want to, we're going to go through this, but some of this has changed in small ways that are important, but conceptually, this will help you understand what's going on. So individuals can create a DID document on their own, and they can share the DID with the issuer. The issuer can do DID authentication to kind of prove that they are in control of that DID. The issuer also generates their own DID document and posts it on the ledger. This becomes important later. And the issuer takes the DID of the holder, the information about them. In this case, let's just say it's somebody issuing a university degree to someone. They package it all up and they sign it, and they then give that to the wallet holder. And so now the wallet holder has a verifiable credential in the standard data format. And oh, I went quickly, so we'll go back here. So I'm the wallet holder. I have my verifiable credential in my wallet, and I am just a newly graduated university, and I want to share my degree with potential employers. So now I can do that. I can share it with the verifier. And what does the verifier do? It does verification. It goes and it does two things. It says, hey, do you really control the DID that this document was anchored to? Yep. And then it checks and sees if I tampered with the information, because it checks the digital signature at the bottom of the verifiable presentation. And it can figure that out by looking up the public keys in the DID document of the issuer and do mathematical calculations to determine that I haven't altered it. And really, really, really importantly is, see that red line where the issuer and the verifier talk that we had in those earlier identity protocol systems? This does not happen. There is no communication between the issuer and the verifier. So the issuer never knows where an individual shares the information they gave them. Really importantly, no PII ends up on the ledger. The only thing that is on the ledger are the public keys of the issuer. And this technology provides an end to the need for username and passwords, because we can use we basically created a way for normal people to use PKI in a way that's secure. And I think we have an opportunity with this for infinitely scalable, low-cost federation. In British Columbia, they've started something called the Verifiable Organizations Network, and I'm going to walk through a little bit of that, because verifiable credentials aren't just for people, they're also for businesses. So we've Mary's Bakery, and Mary has a need to get several different licenses from her city and from the province that she lives in. And she needs to incorporate, so to file the paperwork to become a corporation for her bakery. She needs a health permit, another business license. And in the days before digital, she'd have to go around and physically do all these things. In a place like British Columbia, where many parts of the province are very remote, it's a province the size of California approximately, with about 4 million people. So that once you get out of the major urban cores, it's quite remote. And this is a burden. So what if, when Mary is registering her business, that the province of British Columbia can give her a verifiable credential that says that she did indeed found this business? She could share that with a bank, and the bank can let her open a bank account for her new business, and do this all digitally online. So the credential, this is again shifting, some of these details are changing, but the credential definition can be created and published on the ledger. It doesn't need to be now with some of the new innovations, but nonetheless, the point's still there. And the registry of, in this language, this registry of decentralized identifiers, that's where the blockchain or the ledger is. And you have all these different types of issuers and potential verifiers. And obviously you can have folks that are issuers for some things and verifiers for other things. It's very flexible. They also thought about this chicken and egg dilemma and how do we get this market going. And they decided that they would create a giant database of all the credentials for British Columbia businesses. Businesses do not have privacy rights, their businesses. A lot of this data is very public anyways. So they created the orgbook where you can go today and look up any business in the province of British Columbia. It's a new enrollment experience and it's more convenient. So now Mary has all the proof she needs about her business in her digital wallet with decentralized verifiable credentials that she can carry on her smartphone. A lot of the code for these agent-based systems that British Columbia is using are in the Aries project. So if you're interested, I encourage you to check that out. And with the architectures we've just talked about, now organizations have digital identities and people have their own digital identities. And now we can focus on innovating these open standards for identifiers and data exchange and building the kind of mesh network of people and organizations that we need instead of being stuck with one big portal where large monopolists have control over all of our relationships and connections. So this is another drawing echoing what I shared before, which is that layer 8 is emerging for the individual and for businesses. And I'll just close with this thought for folks who are paying attention. There's a relying party problem in all this. How do we access the data? How do we access sites? And the relying party problem might be able to be addressed by an existing relying party install base of the OpenID Connect. So OpenID is a widely used protocol, and there's a lot of potential to leverage that existing install base to also use verifiable credentials. So with that, I will conclude, and I'm happy to answer any questions folks have. It's great to share with you today. Wow, that's super exciting that there's a session on my data. Oh, but that says it's 2 hours ago. Okay. I'm like, I'm like, where are we? So are there any questions? Oh, there. Oh, okay. Now I'm back. There's so many little buttons. Okay. When do we fix this? What do you mean, Sean? Can I let you on stage? I don't know how to do that. On the quiet, you can pass the question to the stage. Understand. Oh, how would this be adopted? Well, the good news is it already is being adopted. The many different governments are really engaging with this. So I mentioned the British Columbia government, there's the US government. They recently did a whole interoperability plug fest, they called it, using the latest open standards, which are sort of upgrades from what I just shared with you, some of the things. I think it's also building consumer awareness that there is these good alternatives. There's actually a social network that is an alternative to Facebook that uses decentralized identifiers as the anchor for all the people on it, called True. Oh, Q&A. Will quantify the acceptance by the industry about layer 8. I mean, it's I don't know that people are running around talking about it. I think it's just trying to articulate where the standards that we're working on fit in the existing universe of standards people are already familiar with. And we're not trying to replace those lower layers. We're trying to go up above the application, or sort of maybe in between in between the network layer and the application, so that there's actually like space for protocols for people. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a whole set of questions. This question says, what other roles are states taking on in the distributed ledger space beyond business credentials? I think that what is a distributed ledger and what is it good for? Anil John, who's funded the work within the US government, has a really awesome sort of like, should you use a distributed ledger kind of flowchart? Or should you use the blockchain flowchart? And I understand how cryptocurrencies work conceptually, and I don't have opinions about whether governments should get into that space, but it's really totally different than digital identity use cases. So I think there's several business drivers for this. I think one great one is that when companies get, especially, I knew we would be successful when banks started showing up and being like, this is so cool. It's really secure. I was like, awesome. We're giving users control and the banks like it. We're going to win. So the credit unions in the United States have rolled out something called Member Pass that uses this technology to support the credit union members. So credit unions, if you're not familiar, are like happy banks. They're owned by their people who hold accounts at them. So it's pretty cool that network of businesses came together to implement this. One of the reasons they like it too is it supports the enhanced security that it gives them, means that they can have their members access to call centers in much more secure ways. So call centers, when you like call your bank on the phone and you're like, I'm me, and then you say all this information about yourself and they go, okay, you're you. But that's really insecure, because if you know the information, you can pretend to be people and move money. And this way, only if you have the app on your phone and you sort of do an authentication live with the call center, will they talk to you? I also think policy will drive this, and also real world implementation. So the US government's looking at, planning to issue digital green cards using this technology. British Columbia is doing what it's doing. So yeah. And potentially also some of the COVID related credentials. So I've spent the last 3 months of my life working on creating a blueprint for how to reopen global travel using verifiable credentials. I haven't seen The Fifth Element for so long, so I'll have to watch it again. Are we writing a book or what? Sure, I should write a book. I think we may be getting ready. That a new one is in the offing. There is a book. I'm in it. If you want to get a book, here it is. Self-Sovereign Identity by Manning. but there may be a shorter book that is an ebook or something. I don't know. Hopefully this was good for all of you. I think this feels like a good natural place to conclude, but it was really lovely being with all of you, and I hope I can come back.